Arthur Schopenhauer, born February 22, 1788, Danzig, Prussia, now Gdansk, Poland, died September 21, 1860, Frankfurt am Main, Germany, German philosopher, often called the philosopher of pessimism, who was primarily important as the exponent of a metaphysical doctrine of the will and immediate reaction against Hegelian idealism. His writings influenced later existential philosophy and Freudian psychology. Schopenhauer was the son of a wealthy merchant, Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer, and his wife, Joanna, who later became famous for her novels, essays, and travelogues. In 1793, when Danzig came under Prussian sovereignty, they moved to the free city of Hamburg. Arthur enjoyed a gentlemanly private education. He then attended a private business school, where he became acquainted with the spirit of the Enlightenment and was exposed to a pietistic attitude sensitive to the plight of man. In 1803 he accompanied his parents for a year on an extensive journey through Belgium, England, France, Switzerland, and Austria. The sudden death of his father in April 1805 precipitated a decisive change in his life. His mother and his young sister Adele moved to Weimar, where his mother succeeded in joining the social circle of the poets J.W. von Goethe and Christoph Martin Wieland, often called the German Voltaire. Arthur himself had to remain in Hamburg for more than a year, yet with more freedom to engage in the arts and sciences. In May 1807 he was finally able to leave Hamburg. During the next 2 years, spent in Gotha and Weimar, he acquired the necessary academic preparation for attendance at a university. In the fall of 1809 he matriculated as a student of medicine at the University of Göttingen and mainly attended lectures on the natural sciences. As early as his second semester, however, he transferred to the humanities, concentrating first on the study of Plato and Immanuel Kant. From 1811 to 1813 he attended the University of Berlin, where he heard such philosophers as J.G. Fichte and Friedrich Schleiermacher with little appreciation, and in Rudolstadt. During the summer of 1813, he finished his dissertation, Über die Vierfach-Wurzel des Satzes vom zureichenden Grunde, on the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, which earned him a Doctor of Philosophy degree from. The following winter, 1813-14, he spent in Weimar, in intimate association with Goethe, with whom he discussed various philosophical topics. In that same winter the Orientalist Friedrich Major, a disciple of Johann Gottfried Herder, introduced him to the teachings of Indian antiquity, the philosophy of Vedanta and the mysticism of the Vedas, Hindu scriptures. Later, Schopenhauer considered that the Upanishads, philosophic Vedas, together with Plato and Kant, constituted the foundation on which he erected his own philosophical system. In May 1814 he left his beloved Weimar after a quarrel with his mother over her frivolous way of life, of which he disapproved. He then lived in Dresden until 1818, associating occasionally with a group of writers for the Dresdner Abendblatt, Dresden evening newspaper. Schopenhauer finished his treatise Über das Sehen und die Farben, 1816, on vision and colors, supporting Goethe against Isaac Newton. His next 3 years were dedicated exclusively to the preparation and composition of his main work, Die Welt als Wille und Vorstellung, 1819, The World as Will and Idea. The fundamental idea of this work, which is condensed into a short formula in the title itself, is developed in 4 books composed of 2 comprehensive series of reflections that include successively the theory of knowledge and the philosophy of nature, aesthetics, and the first book begins with Kant. The world is my representation, says Schopenhauer. It is only comprehensible with the aid of the constructs of man's intellect, space, time, and causality. But these constructs show the world only as appearance, as a multiplicity of things next to and following one another, not as the thing in itself, which Kant considered to be unknowable. The second book advances to a consideration of the essences of the concepts presented. Of all the things in the world, only one is presented to a person in 2 ways. He knows himself externally as body or as appearance, and he knows himself internally as part of the primary essence of all things, as will. The will is the thing in itself. It is unitary, unfathomable, unchangeable, beyond space and time, without causes and purposes. In the world of appearances, it is reflected in an ascending series of realizations. From the blind impulses and the forces of inorganic nature, through organic nature, plants and animals, to the rationally guided actions of men, an enormous chain of restless desires, agitations, and drives stretch forth, a continual struggle of the higher forms against the lower, an eternally aimless and insatiable striving, inseparably united with misery and misfortune. At the end, however, stands death, the great reproof that the will to live receives, posing the question to each single person, have you had enough? Whereas the first two books present the will in an affirmative mode, the last two, dealing with aesthetics and ethics, surpass them by pointing to the negation of the will as a possible liberation, evoking as their leading figures the genius and the saint, who illustrate this negation. These books present the pessimistic worldview that values non-being more highly than being. The arts summon man to a burlesque way of viewing things, in which the play of the passions ceases. To the succession of levels achieved by the realizations of the will corresponds a gradation. The book marked the summit of Schopenhauer's thought. In the many years thereafter, no further development of his philosophy occurred, no inner struggles or changes, no critical reorganization of basic thoughts. From then onward, his work consisted merely of more detailed exposition, clarification, and affirmation. In March 1820, after a lengthy first tour of Italy and a triumphant dispute with Hegel, he qualified to lecture at the University of Berlin. Though he remained a member of the university for 24 semesters, only his first lecture was actually held, for he had scheduled, and continued to schedule, his lectures at the same hour when Hegel lectured to a large and ever-growing audience. Clearly, he could not successfully challenge a persistently advancing philosophy. Even his book received scant attention. For a second time Schopenhauer went on a year-long trip to Italy, and this was followed by a year of illness in Munich. In May 1825 he made one last attempt in Berlin, but in vain. He now occupied himself with secondary works, primarily translations. Scholarly retirement in Frankfurt. During his remaining 28 years, he lived in Frankfurt, which he felt to be free from the threat of cholera, and left the city only for brief interludes. He had finally renounced his career as a university professor and lived henceforth as a recluse, totally absorbed in his studies, especially in the natural sciences, and his writings. His life now took on the shape that posterity first came to know, the measured uniformity of the days, the strict, ascetic lifestyle modeled after Kant, the old-fashioned attire, the tendency to gesticulative. The second edition of The World as Will and Idea, 1844, included an additional volume but failed to break what he called the resistance of a dull world. The little weight that Schopenhauer's name carried became evident when 3 publishers rejected his latest work. Finally, a rather obscure Berlin bookseller accepted the manuscript without remuneration. In this book, which brought the beginning of worldwide recognition, Schopenhauer turned to significant topics hitherto not treated individually within the framework of his writings. The work of 6 years yielded the essays and comments compiled in 2 volumes under the title Parerga Paralipomena, 1851. The Parerga, minor works, include fragments concerning the history of philosophy, the famous treatise Über die Universitäts Philosophie, the enigmatically profound Transzendentische Spekulation über die Einzelnen and Absichtlichkeit im Schicksal der Einzelnen, transcendent speculation on the apparent premeditation and personal fate, the Versuch über das Geistrein und was damit zusammenhängt, essay on Ghost-seeing and its related aspects, the first investigation, classification, and critical reflection concerning parapsychology, and the aforizmalar Lebensweisheit, aphorisms on practical wisdom, a serene and brilliant account garnered from his long life. The Paralipomena, remnants, or as Schopenhauer called them separate, yet systematically ordered thoughts on various subjects, included essays on writing and style, on women, on education, on noise and sound, and on numerous other topics. During the last years of his life, he added the finishing touches to most of his works. Even the 3rd edition of The World as Will and Idea, containing an exultant preface, appeared in 1859 and, in 1860, a 2nd edition of his Ethics. Soon after Schopenhauer's sudden and painless death, Julius Frauenstadt published new and enlarged editions, with many handwritten editions, of the Parerga and Parallelopomena, 1862, on the Fourfold Root, 1864, the Essay on the Will and Nature, 1867, the Treatise on Colors, 1870, and finally even a fourth edition of his main work, 1873. Later that same year, Frauenstadt